Hundreds of our members have registered for this session, which speaks to the importance of tonight's topic. If you're new to NASET, our members receive free access to webinars like this one, along with expert-led training, exclusive resources, and discounts on our professional development certifications. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Dr. Nadine Gabb for a timely and critical conversation on the pediatric brain, learning disabilities, and screening tools for literacy milestones and dyslexia.
Welcome to this webinar. I want to start today with a question. The fundamental milestones for learning to read are sound and language processing, and they start in utero. So learning to read actually starts prenatally in utero. Learning to read is a process that requires the mastering of a series of developmental stages in response to the environment. And it starts with sound and language processing in utero and ends many, many years later with proficient reading. Learning to read is not a natural process. It's very unlike language development, where if you just immerse a child in a rich language development, they somehow pick up the sounds, the meaning, the grammar, the structure, the pragmatics, so when to use what kind of language. But it's not the case with reading. So you can't lock a child in the library for a couple of years and think they're emerging as readers, right? So if you look at this timeline, we already established that learning to read starts in utero here, but then after that, after you're born, you will learn which sounds belong to your language or languages. From there, you are learning the meaning of words, you're learning the grammar, the syntax, the structure, the pragmatics, so when to speak and when to stop and how to speak maybe differently to your brother than to your, teacher, etc. And after all these years, at one point, someone will ask you to map the sounds of language that you've been exposed to since in utero onto graphemes. But that probably doesn't happen until maybe age 3 or 4. So if you think about reading development starting in utero, the first 3-4 years of reading development are oral language development. And that's another important key point to take away from tonight. We cannot ignore oral language because that's the precursor, that's the foundation of decoding written language. You probably, or most of you, have seen this graphic. That's the reading rope by Hollis Gabor. There's two main strengths that have to come together in order to develop into a skilled reader. We have what we call the mechanics of learning to read, which is the word recognition piece, right? So phonological awareness is really important for this. You need to develop spelling sound correspondence. You need to know the alphabet. You need to start recognizing words, right? In the beginning, you decode them, but with increasing automaticity, you just recognize them as a whole, which we call like a sight word recognition. You could be the best decoder. If you don't know the meaning of the word you just decoded, it's kind of useless, right? It will slow you down and it will impact your fluency and your comprehension. But it's not just the vocabulary that impacts the overall trajectory here. It's also, your familiarity with language structure. So let's say you have a very complex sentence with 3 commas. You know all the words there in the sentence, right? Vocabulary wise, and you can decode all the words, but you've just never heard of a sentence with that level of complexity. So if you decode it, you will understand most parts, but you will not be able to put them together because you have a hard time understanding how the end of the sentence relates to the beginning of the sentence, relates to the middle of the sentence. That can also impact your fluency and your comprehension. Most people don't understand what the science of reading actually is. So it's not a philosophy or a new trend. It is evidence to inform how proficient reading and writing develops, why some have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach and improve student outcome through prevention and intervention. So every child has the right to learn to read well, but as you probably know really well, we do have a reading crisis in this country, right? So if you look at the NAP scores, you want to really read either proficient or advanced. And if you're interested, what you need to know in order to be proficient on the NAP, they have some samples on the website, and it's very simple. It's like reading sentence and answering questions. So basic is not advanced. And it's not something that we would call grade level. But as you can see in 2024, 69% of fourth graders were not reading on grade level. That not just has tremendous implication for their academic outcomes, for their vocational outcomes, but it's also linked to mental health. So we know that if you have low reading skills, that this is often linked to low self-esteem, feeling of shame, helplessness, greater risk for developing, internalizing and externalizing symptoms. And as I said before, kids who read at lower education levels, less income, increased health issues, and higher incarceration and poverty rates. So there's even some estimates that a third to a fourth of all inmates in the United States have some form of a reading disability. It affects about 7 to 12% of children, and that's about 2 to 3 in each classroom. It's difficulties with accurate and fluent word reading, as well as poor spelling and decoding. We can go back to the rope, and kids with dyslexia initially have problems with the word recognition piece. The difficulties with word recognition will impact automaticity, will impact reading fluency, will impact reading comprehension, and sadly, will also impact their language. The ones that are good readers increase their vocabulary, but the poor readers don't, because they're just not adding new vocabulary words or new sentence structures to their repertoire, which then will impact both sides of the rope. So learning disabilities, rarely come alone. So someone with a reading disability often shows co-occurrence of other specific learning disabilities, such as dyscalculia or dysgraphia, but also with other neurodevelopmental disabilities such as ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. And there's also, like we said, this co-occurrence of these internalizing and externalizing behaviors like anxiety and depression, where it's often really hard to pinpoint, was the depression first, which causes the reading? Was the reading disability first, which causes the anxiety? It's really important to tease that apart and try to figure this out, because that can have tremendous impact on intervention. So what are the factors contributing to reading disabilities? So we have genetics, we have the brain, we have perception, cognition, and we have the environment. So there will never be a gene for dyslexia. And what we do know now is that there are dyslexia susceptibility genes. So these are genes that are somewhat involved in